heel elevated, narrow stance, goblet squat. Now, before we get into the movement, we're gonna go through the setup. For the heel elevation here, I'm using 2.5 kilo plates. They're about 3 to 4 centimeters thick, maybe more, maybe less, who knows. But they're pretty universal, and this is oftentimes the most common tool used. You can get away with using a dumbbell for the elevation. You can get away with using like a thick bumper plate, which is really common when performing this variation especially. Because essentially the more heel elevation you have, the easier it'll be to go deeper on the movement. So when it comes to the setup, the plates or the elevation, whatever you're using, on a quick note, just make sure it won't slide on you either. So you want to use a safe elevation that's got friction on the floor. That way you won't risk it sliding out underneath you when performing the exercise. So going back to the setup, because it's a narrow stance goblet squat, your feet are going to be somewhat close to each other. So this means that heel elevation is going to be close to each other as well. I'm going to be using a dumbbell, but you can use a kettlebell, you can use a dead ball, a weight plate, whatever you want, so long as it's sufficient and challenging. I'm then going to just have only sort of the back end of my heel on the elevation, holding the weight out in front, conscious of my posture, keeping my gaze forward and sinking down to a full squat. Now, some things to keep in mind with the movement. Focusing on full range of motion and control. We'd never want to be in a position where we're losing control, so much so to the point that the quality of the movement changes. So for some, if you go too deep, for example, you might drop your chest, you might slouch, your knees might cave in, and that's something we want to avoid. If your position changes because you're going so deep, then reduce the range of motion slightly, build confidence, and eventually work towards that full range of motion. Reason why full range of motion is always priority and always key to performing a movement correctly. Other than that, when it comes to pushing and placing pressure through your feet, you want to think about applying pressure through your midfoot. I know this doesn't necessarily make sense to some because your midfoot isn't actually in contact with the ground, especially with the heel elevation right now. But essentially, it's just a way to think about placing even pressure through both your heel and your toe. You just want to have even, constant pressure through both your heel and your toe. So an easy way to think about it, just think about pushing through the middle of your foot. Other than that, movement's pretty straightforward. You should feel a good deal of burn through your thighs. If I haven't mentioned already, placement should be hip width. Being a narrow stance, the placement of the plates, elevation, and your feet should be hip width. If that's too hard, you can go a little bit wider, but aim to keep the stance more narrow.